Now, what I'm talking about today has to do with a book of mine that I published a few months ago, whose basic conclusion I reached when I was 14 years old, which is there's no free will whatsoever. A book called Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will, which I spent the last 5 years writing. And it is almost uniformly rejected as being too extreme or whatever, insofar as I am way out on the lunatic fringe, even among scientists, brain scientists. Instead of saying there's far less free will than we normally think of, my stance is there's no free will whatsoever. So what we see here is, I think, something that summarizes all of the argument, in that starting right off at the beginning of life, at the moment of birth, in some ways, you are already having your future set in stone. Just as this one example, suppose this kid who is winding up in Mississippi rather than Norway, simply by being born in Mississippi, 11 years shorter life expectancy, 5 times the infant mortality, 41 times the chance of dying when this child is eventually pregnant and giving birth, 39 times the chance of being murdered at some point, considerably less literacy. Okay, this is officially horrifying. And what is most horrifying here is that the way in which this child's trajectory is being set is already 9 months old at this point. And the argument I am making is, when you look at all of the influences, all of the things that made us who we are starting at conception, all the way up to 1 second ago, what we are is nothing more than the sum of the biology over which we had no control, and its interactions with environment over which we had no control. Now, to begin to get more of a sense of this, starting at fetal life right there. Let's see, is there a way to get rid of this stuff? No. Starting right at fetal life. When you are born, you have already shared 9 very intimate months with your mother. And depending on your fetal environment, that can cause significantly increased odds of all sorts of neurodevelopmental, neuropsychiatric disorders early in life and throughout all of life. Be malnourished as a fetus, and you've got a 19-fold increased likelihood of being obese and having hypertension when you're 60 years old. Have exposure to certain stress hormones from your mother while you're a fetus, and as an adult, you are more likely to have an anxiety disorder or depression. Life is already beginning to do things to you over which you have no control while you were still a fetus. And from there, we go to our next stage, childhood. Hooray, science has recently discovered, like in the last 300 or 400 years, that childhood matters. The sort of childhood somebody has is going to enormously shape who they are as an adult. By the way, history fans will recognize bottom left as Stalin's daughter, a very interesting trajectory of things over which she had no control in her life, and childhood. And all we've been trying to do since then is understand, how is it that different childhoods over which you had no control produce different adulthoods? And this takes us into this incredibly sexy world these days of what is termed epigenetics. Experience throughout life, but especially early in life, beginning in fetal life, experience doesn't change your DNA, doesn't change your genetics, doesn't change the sequence of your genome. What experience does epigenetically is change the regulation of it. How readily genes are turned on or off in this part of your body, this part of your brain for the next 3 minutes, for the rest of your life, multi-generationally. And what epigenetics is about is the way in which stuff you had no control over in childhood played a role in making you who you are today. Now, we understand by now a ton about this. Just to give an example, okay, amazingly enough, for those of you who are not tuned to rats, there are some rat mothers who are more attentive mothers than other rat mothers. Some rat mothers groom their kids a lot, lick them a lot, pick them up, carry them around, respond to the kids' ultrasonic vocalizations more quickly than other. And if you lucked out and you had a mother who was highly attentive, That causes epigenetic changes in your brain so that as an adult, you secrete fewer stress hormones than if you had a neurotic, anxious mother who never groomed you or licked you. As an adult, you would have different stress hormone levels, which would have a big impact on your likelihood of cognitive decline during old age, your likelihood of a variety of diseases, your likelihood of all sorts of stuff, and would also be by influencing your stress hormone levels, would be influencing your fetus and passing on this profile. So early life events over which you have no control, having lifelong effects on your gene regulation. What sort of early life effects? One of the things we're coming to really appreciate is culture. What culture were you being raised in? Which is another way of asking, what culture was your mother raised in? And one of the classic contrasts that people study like crazy is the contrast between collectivist cultures, typically collectivist rice-growing regions of Southeast Asia, individualist cultures. The United States is the poster child for individualistic ones. And what people show is, depending on which mother you happen to randomly wind up with within minutes of birth, her cultural upbringing, collectivist versus individualist, is going to have influenced how loudly she sings lullabies to you, how much time you spend in physical contact with her. On the average, how many seconds would pass when you started to cry before she would pick you up? Every aspect of that, starting within minutes of birth, already being shaped by the culture your ancestors came up with 400 years ago. Be born to people whose ancestors were hunter-gatherers living in a rainforest, and you were much more likely to be a polytheist than you were born to people who were pastoralists in the desert. You were more likely to be a monotheist. If your ancestors were wheat growers versus farm growers, if your ancestors were in an environment with a high infectious disease load 400 years later, you were being raised in a culture that is more hostile to outsiders, more hostile to immigrants. All of this occurring early in life, ecology centuries ago, shaping culture centuries ago, shaping how your brain was epigenetically being constructed within minutes of birth. Of course, what also matters is the family environment beyond culture. And what we have here is the grand summary of ways in which you could have incredibly lousy luck in childhood if you have lots of adverse childhood experiences. And this is formalized by now. Every developmental psychologist, every pediatrician, etc., knows about somebody's ACE score, adverse childhood experience, and their ACE score, and you can get anywhere from the incredibly lucky 0 on the scale to the unthinkable 10 as a function of if you were exposed to physical abuse as a childhood. That's 1 point on the scale. Sexual abuse, psychological abuse. Was there somebody mentally ill in the family? Were your parents divorced? Were you in the household of somebody with substance abuse? All of that, you get 1 more point on your scale. And remarkably, horrifyingly, for every additional point, a 35% increased likelihood that as a young adult, you will have a history of antisocial violence. If you were female, that you had a teen pregnancy. If you were of either sex, that you will have substance abuse problems as an adult, that you will have problems with mood disorders like depression and anxiety, every step along the way doing this. And what we realize is this interacts with genes as well. For example, there's one type of gene, it's called MAO alpha. It's got something to do with serotonin in the brain. Don't write that down. It has nothing to do with the details. But this gene comes in 2 flavors. And what we knew from rat studies, from monkey studies for years is if you got the bad version, the bad flavor, you were more at risk for being aggressive. That's what the animal studies showed. So then, amazing landmark study following thousands of kids for 25 years and with their genetic information, asking that basic question. Okay, if you had the bad version of this gene, were you more likely to have a history of antisocial violence as an adult? And the answer was yes, if and only if you were maltreated as a child. If you had no history of maltreatment as a child, if you came in with your ACE score around 0 or so, there was no effect of the gene. But have this vulnerability gene and couple it with a miserably adverse childhood environment, and the gene has a huge effect on likelihood here, a fourfold effect. So we see early life, stuff you had no control over, your great-grandparents' culture, what your home life was like, what your genes were like, etc., already beginning to turn you into who you are, stuff you could not have done otherwise. So now we switch to adolescence. And the single fact about adolescence is encompassed in this slide. Nucleus accumbens is the part of the brain that's got to do with reward and pleasure and anticipation and motivation and novelty seeking and all of that, the neurotransmitter dopamine. And what we see here in this slide is by the time you're like 12 years old, your nucleus accumbens is going almost at full speed. And sitting there, the other line of the chart is another part of the brain. For my money, the most interesting part of the brain, most recently evolved. We've got more of it than any other species on Earth, called the prefrontal cortex. What does it do? It makes you do the harder thing when that's the right thing to do. Impulse control, gratification postponement, emotion regulation, long-term planning, all of that. If you are tempted to do something for sheer pleasure, parentheses, if your nucleus accumbens and related areas are telling you to do it, and you manage to resist the temptation, it's because your prefrontal cortex got there in time and said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I know this is really tempting. I know this seems like a great idea. You're going to regret it. Don't do it. Don't do it. And what we see here is the most defining fact about adolescence, which is your prefrontal cortex is not fully online yet. It is the last part of your brain to fully mature, meaning you are running through adolescence. This is the neurobiological explanation of why juveniles behave in juvenile ways, because all the emotional pull towards impulses and sensation and stuff is going full blast, while your prefrontal cortex has barely anything to say. What we see here is, among other things, what's going on in your late adolescence, what's going on in your early adulthood is the last chance in which environment played a major role in sculpting what kind of prefrontal cortex you've got today. So we hurtle further along in time. Now we look in adulthood and we say, well, what has happened to you over the previous months, over the previous decades? Have you experienced all sorts of adverse things like in red? Have you experienced all sorts of wonderful things in blue? And what we now know is tons about this whole sexy new field of neuroplasticity. Experience changes the brain. Like, not subtle. I don't just mean experience changes the regulation of this or that gene. Experience changes how excitable certain synapses are. Experience will change the birth of new neurons, will kill other neurons, will change the volume dramatically of different parts of your brain, go through post-traumatic stress disorder, and a part of the brain called the amygdala is going to have expanded in size. You could see it on a brain scan, and one consequence of that is you are going to see threat that other people don't. Have decades of major depression, and you are going to see atrophy of the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which has lots to do with learning and memory. All of this stuff happening, all of these things having nothing to do with stuff you could have controlled, your biology interacting with your environment, producing these adult changes in the brain. Okay, but we push further along. Forget recent decades. How about your hormone levels yesterday? How about your hormone levels as you were just going about today's business, those hormones affecting all sorts of stuff in your body? So here we get to not what your fetal life was, not your childhood, adolescence, the last few decades, but your hormone levels this morning. Here's an amazing example of it. The hormone oxytocin. Everybody knows what oxytocin does. It makes people more compassionate and generous and trusting. It promotes monogamy. It promotes mother-infant bonding. Remarkable finding. It promotes bonding between humans and their dogs. Oxytocin makes people nicer. Not really. And here is one study showing that it's much more complicated than that. Oxytocin, this was a study done in the Netherlands, and you can see in the middle a classic problem in philosophy, the runaway trolley. A trolley has broken loose of its brakes, it's hurtling down, is going to kill 5 people, and you have to make the decision, do you pull a lever to divert the trolley onto a side branch, which will kill 1 person? Is it okay to sacrifice 1 for 5? Classic utilitarian philosophy, and the whole field is built around the way you phrase it. You get completely different answers from people. So in this study, they sat down a bunch of these psychology students in the Netherlands, and they gave them the runaway trolley problem. What they did was they gave a name to the person lying on the track who you were going to have to sacrifice or not. They either gave the person a good old boy Dutch name like Dirk or Peter, or a name from one of the 2 groups that evoke the most negative connotations of people in the Netherlands: Germans, oh, that's right, World War II, or Muslim names. So you're sitting there and you got a choice. Are you going to sacrifice Dirk to save 5? Meanwhile, are you going to sacrifice Otto, or you're going to sacrifice Mahmoud? And under this circumstance, no difference. Give somebody oxytocin, and they're much more likely to save Dirk's life, and they're much more likely to throw Otto or Mahmoud or Wolfgang or Ahmed under the bus there. What does oxytocin do? It doesn't make you nicer. It makes you nicer to people who count as an us. It makes you more aggressive to thems, to out-group members. It's not just doing something. So that's going on. What were your oxytocin levels this morning? Meanwhile, testosterone, whether you are female or male, it is relevant to ask what your testosterone levels have been like for the last 10 hours. And if they are elevated, you are more likely to perceive a neutral face as threatening. You're more likely to activate neural pathways related to fear and anxiety and aggression. You are more likely to make a conclusion about the world, not because you carefully thought through your decisions and your judgments and such, but modulated by a hormone level over which you had no control. Now, pushing even further closer in time, forget this morning stuff. How about in the previous minutes? How about the previous seconds? And there's a whole literature by now showing stuff going on in our bodies, stuff going on in the sensory environment around us, influencing our behaviors where we haven't a clue that's happening. We have no idea that those things are relevant. Here's an example. This is one that has gotten a lot of renown, and this is one that's been challenged statistically by some people, and the authors have absolutely answered it acceptably. They're fine by it. This is the famed hungry judge phenomenon, a study showing one of the biggest predictors of decisions judges will make in parole boards as to whether they parole somebody or they send them back to jail is how many hours it has been since the judge ate a meal. Appear before a judge right after they've had lunch, you would have a 60% chance of parole in this very carefully done study. By 4 hours later, 0% chance. And what's amazing about that, 2 things. First off, we know something about how this works. Hours go by after lunch and your blood glucose levels get lower. And when that happens, the most expensive part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, doesn't work as well. What's the prefrontal cortex doing? It's got the hard job of sitting there saying, what's the world look like from this person's perspective? They had a totally different childhood than I did. Their world is completely different. Maybe I need to walk a mile in there. The prefrontal cortex takes a lot of glucose in order to do the harder thing. The more hours since a meal, the easier it is for somebody to just say, just take the easy way out, send them back to jail. And the second amazing thing about it is if you sit down a judge and you say to them, wow, that's really interesting. Somebody, remember right after lunch, you paroled that person, and this guy did the same thing and you just sent him back to jail. What's that about? They're not going to tell you about their blood glucose levels. They're going to tell you about freshman philosophy and Immanuel Kant or who knows what sort of thing. And this has been found in other settings since then. If you are hoping to get a home loan, do not go to the bank officer when they've gone 3 hours without a meal. If you're going in an ER and you are hoping that the doctors there have their lowest levels of implicit biases, see them right after they've eaten or slept, all of that occurring in just this subterranean world of sensation. Another example of this, another version, here we take one of the truly depressing findings in this whole field, put somebody in a brain scanner, and you flash up faces, a face like every second or so. And what has been shown, replicated in a number of studies, is you flash up the face of somebody of a different race. And in about 75% of people, the amygdala, fear, anxiety, aggression, the amygdala will activate in 60 to 70 thousandths of a second before you are even consciously aware of what you're looking at. Oh my God, hardwired racism. This is the most depressing thing imaginable. Now do the study a little bit differently. Get somebody who's a Giants obsessive and thus they hate the LA Dodgers. And now what's happening is you're flashing up these faces and each face has a baseball cap on. And if the baseball cap is showing that of the dread enemy, the Dodgers, the amygdala activates in under a fraction of a second. You've completely stopped looking at skin color. Who counts as an us and a them now is built around baseball team allegiance, some tribal arbitrary thing. We are very hardwired as to dividing the world into us's and thems, but we are totally malleable as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them, and it could change in a fraction of a second. Okay, when you put all these pieces together, what you begin to see is we have this whole world of prompting and cueing when we look at faces of familiar people, popular people, whether it activates anxiety parts of the brain, disgust parts of the brain, social affiliation parts. We have this whole world where a them could be an honorary the us if they are popular enough of a celebrity, all of that. Your brain being modulated within seconds of that. Okay, so what do we begin to see here? You try to understand how we became who we are, and it is the end product of stuff we had no control over from a second before to a million years before and everything in between. Now, the easy conclusion at this point would be, wow, okay, neuroscience doesn't prove there's no free will. And genetics doesn't prove there's no free will, and hormones and cultural anthropology, because there's always exceptions, but put them all together and each discipline plugs one other discipline's loophole. That's not what I'm saying. The most striking thing is when you look at these different influences, they're not different influences. They all merge into the same thing. If you are, for example, talking about the effects of genes on behavior, by definition, you're talking about millions of years of evolution when those genes were evolving. By definition, you were talking about 9 months of fetal life when all sorts of epigenetic changes were occurring to those genes. By definition, you're talking about breakfast this morning when you were making proteins from those genes. When you put all these pieces together, it is one seamless, continuous arc of biology over which we had no control, interacting with environment over which we had no control. And when you look at the science of it, there is not a crack in that edifice in which you could squeeze in free will. And at this point, what has traditionally been the challenge is free will believers say to folks like us, oh yeah, prove there's no free will. Prove there's no Easter bunny, prove the absence of, proof of absence, that whole thing. By this point, we know enough about the science of how you came to be who you are that the onus of proof has switched. Prove to us, show us a mechanism by which a neuron, a brain, a person has done something, and it is completely freed from their biological history, where it doesn't matter what went on in the brain a second ago, hormones, genes, culture, any of that show us a behavior that has just happened, freed of all of that, and you have just proven there's free will, and you simply can't. Now, it's in this realm that we begin to look at two domains where people are most resistant to the idea that there's no free will. First one, you make a choice. You choose something. You're choosing flavored ice cream. You're choosing whether or not to shoot somebody. You form an intent and you act on it. And for most people, including in our legal system, intent, you know consciously that you intended to do this. You have a fairly good sense of what the outcome's going to be. And most importantly, you know you didn't have to do it. You had alternatives. For most people, that is necessary and sufficient to decide you had free will. And for where I'm coming from, that misses 99% of what's happening. That's asking somebody to review a movie by seeing the last 30 seconds of it and nothing other than that, because you're not asking the only possible question. How did you turn out to be the sort of person who would have that intent? Where did that intent come from? Because that's built around everything from 1 second ago to 1,000,000 years ago, over which you had no control. And it's all built around, that's great that you could consciously act upon an intent, but you cannot successfully have intended to do something different from what you intend. You can't will yourself to have more willpower. You can't wish for what you're going to wish for next successfully. The only question to be asked is, how did you become that person who in that moment had that intent? Now, the other domain where people always fall for there must be free will is when we look at the inspiring exceptions, these amazing examples of tenacity, of backbone, of gumption, of self-discipline, of motivation, how all of you studied so hard on those Saturday nights while your roommate was going out to get falling down drunk, and where that paid off, the exceptions to what could have been otherwise an abysmal outcome, or the exceptions in the other direction, the people who had every opportunity and every privilege and every gift and they squandered it, they threw it away. We look at the realm of gumption, of tenacity, of squandering, and we make an incredibly dangerous false dichotomy. There's things we were handed, attributes over which we had no control, and that's biological stuff. But then there's, what do you do with it? Do you show backbone? Do you squander? And that's made out of fairy dust. That's made out of something different. And we make this massive false dichotomy there, and we see free will all over the place on the right side of that chart. And the critical point there is your natural attributes and what you do with them are both made of the exact same biology. And the stuff on the right is overwhelmingly about how your prefrontal cortex that you have right now came to be the one that you have. Okay, so let me wind down at this point. What are we left with? This totally nutty sense of implications. If you actually decide there's no free will at all, you have earned nothing. You are entitled to nothing. Blame and punishment make no sense at all. Praise and reward make no sense at all. The fundamental building blocks of everything from the criminal justice system to our notions of meritocracy are medieval in their viewpoints. And also, if you really believe there's no free will, hating somebody is like hating an earthquake, is like hating a virus because it's good at getting into your lung cells. None of those make any sense. And all that said, as I noted, I've been thinking this way since I was about 14, that entitlement and earning anything makes no sense, and hatred and then punishment and praise and all of that make no sense. I've been thinking that way since I was 14, and I can actually function that way about 3 minutes every other month or so. This is going to be incredibly difficult to be able to act upon this. And the last point I want to make is, incredibly difficult though it is, we've done it over and over again throughout history. Again and again, we have realized, oh, We're not making a free choice there. Oh, I had no idea biology had something to do with this. And we subtract out free will. And not only has the roof not fallen in, even better, the world has become a more humane place. At some point along the way, we realized witches don't control the weather. And it's a good thing that we don't burn the old woman with no teeth living on the edge of the hamlet at the stake anymore. We figured out that's not a realm of stuff we had no control over. At some point, it was a good thing 200 years ago. We figured out that an epileptic seizure is a disease. It's not a sign of demonic possession. At some point in the last 50 years, we figured out that lousy mothers soaked in psychodynamic Freudian toxicity are not the causes of schizophrenia. We figured out that autism is not caused by mothers who are incapable of love. We figured out some kids have trouble learning to read, not because they're lazy or unmotivated or not that very smart, because they have architectural problems in one layer of their cortex. And as a result, they flip closed loop letters and they have dyslexia. We've learned the biological bases of obesity, where it doesn't matter how self-disciplined you are, all with every one of these steps where we have subtracted out a sense that we have control over who we became, the world has become a more humane place. So even though it's going to be very difficult to do, and again, I can do this only every now and then before I fall back into my time and place of blame and praise and all of that, nonetheless, every time we manage to do the hard work and subtract out another domain where we perceive ourselves as having free will, where there is none at all, the world becomes a much more kind place. So let me stop at this point and let's see if there's any questions.
Well, thank you so much. I am Kathy, and I have the privilege of looking through the questions. There are actually more than 60 of them. So we're going to sort of take them, I think, in batches. And people have been upvoting as we have been listening. And I want to encourage people to go ahead and also upvote. Those will pop to the top, and we'll answer as many as we can. So the first question is kind of the now what question. So what is our role in life? Are we observing a movie that's already been made? I think this goes to sort of questions of both purpose and also what do we do with this if the people who study it spend only 3 minutes a day in this state.
Oh, that's on a good day. It's a day. It's every month or so. Okay. What we shouldn't worry about immediately, some stuff that immediately comes to mind is oh my God, everybody's going to run amok if they stop believing in free will. There is a whole science by now showing that is not going to be the case. If you raise people thinking that there is no free will, they wind up with just as ethical of a worldview as the people who have the strongest beliefs in we are responsible for actions and have to be held culpable for it. Second worry, oh my God, we're going to have murderers running around everywhere. What do we do about that? That one is easy, I say blithely. What we have there is the criminal justice system, which is predicated on free will, makes no sense whatsoever. It has to be tossed out its entirety. I was talking to the Southern District Appellate Court judges the other week about all this, and they were like completely delighted by what I had to say. But you can oh my God, we'll just have murderers everywhere. Not at all. Over and over, we have learned how to subtract out responsibility and still protect society from dangerous individuals. Let me give you an example. Here's a human who is dangerous to people around them. People have to be protected from them. Your 5-year-old child who has a nose cold. And what do they do in kindergarten? They say, please, if your child is sneezing, keep them home so they don't get everybody else sick. Contain them, constrain them, quarantine them, but don't tell your kid the next day when they're staying home, you can't play with your toys because you did something rotten by sneezing all over the place. You don't moralize, you don't preach to them, but we used to. We used to think that illness was a sign of an inner life filled with sin, all of that. We can do this over and over again. Where we got a much bigger problem is if meritocracies make no sense either, oh my God, not only are we going to have murderers running around in the street, but you get a brain tumor and they're going to pick a person at random to take out your brain tumor because we're getting rid of the meritocracies. We're going to have ways to make sure not only are we protected from dangerous people, but that we are helped by competent people. This is the third thing that everybody always worries about is, oh my God, if there's no free will, everything is determined, nothing can ever change, everything can change. Once you understand, we do not choose to change. We are changed by circumstance. And we are changed by circumstance as a function of the person we have been turned into at the moment we experience that circumstance. So I think these are all these domains where people's immediate panic is in fact unwarranted, and sort of fuels me with this would be a great thing for each additional step that we could manage to do this. When you make a judgment, go back and think about it a second time and a fifth time and a 20th time and think about if that's really how the world is working.
So that leads to a couple of the other questions people wanted to know about. And one of the things I heard you say is if we raise people thinking there's no free will, and I thought, well, how do you do that? Do you have a choice in that? Which one of the more popular questions is, what do you tell your kids if you have kids about free will?
Great. That's something I wrestled with my own kids. Fortunately, my wife and I are tuned to this and all sorts of other lunatic fringe beliefs that we inflicted on our children. Um, it's a whole different mindset of, instead of thinking about how you earned something, and this immediately throws us into this wonderful world of Carol Dweck in the psych department, who any of you who will be, or have been a totally neurotic parent will know about her work, which shows your kid does something amazing and you have a choice. You could say to them, wow, that's such a great score on your test. You must be so smart. Versus, wow, such a great score on the test. You must have worked so hard. Do the latter. That's more motivating. All of that. And that's a world built around a belief in free will. And you got to choose between the two. Yeah, do the latter. But where you need to raise kids instead is constantly saying, wow, how'd that kid who's bullying you, how's that kid who's not as good at math as you are, how's that kid who's better at math than you are, how did that person wind up being that person? How do you wind up being who you are? Did you choose us as your parents? Did you choose mom's womb? Did you choose this? Did you choose the fact that you have a good digit span, that you've got perfect pitch, that you don't, how do you turn out to be this sort of person? Did you have any control? And how did they? And I think if that's the world you raise your kids in, and then take them through where antecedent causes come from, and especially take them through the really cognitive challenging task of thinking about distributed causality. Yeah, a little bit of this, and then that factor, and then this other. And if this hadn't happened, maybe they'd be a little bit more this way, and put all the pieces together. And that's how they wound up being who they are. And they had no control over it any more than you had control over the fact that you picked an educated upper middle class family that loves you to bits. Not easy.
Right. So that gets to, I think there's a few questions around the theme of criminality. And it seems as though people are following the argument and accepting the argument about fault, right? And maybe there are a lot of circumstances led somebody to the point where they committed what we as society defines as a crime. But they also want to know, okay, but are we also not predestined at some level to have retributive impulses and to punish that person? So in other words, we've got the first half, which is the perpetrator, but what about the second half, which is essentially the judge, the jury, the desire for retribution?
Yeah, we got a problem with that one, which is, whether you study from the standpoint of game theory and evolutionary biology, or brain chemistry and what sort of things make you release dopamine in your brain, it feels really good to punish somebody righteously. It's really rewarding. It's really great. And that's a big problem. It's very reinforcing. Rats will decrease their stress hormone levels if they get to bite another rat when they're frustrated. We will release dopamine like crazy when we get to punish somebody when we're playing the prisoner's dilemma game against them and they've stabbed us in the back and we get to stab them back. Righteousness is very pleasing. And I devote one chapter in the book sort of taking us through the history of punishment over the last 1,000 years in Western Europe and where we've gone from it is pleasurable to take a norm violator and burn them to death in the town square while you run amok with you and your buddies to you got to watch the authorities do that to the person in the town square as they draw and quarter them to, well, okay, they can't draw and quarter anymore, but you're going to have to get your pleasure merely from watching the person being hung to you're going to have to believe us behind the walls of the prison. We've hung the person. You can't see it, but we'll give you witnesses afterward to tell you how it went. And you're going to have to get your sense of pleasure at punishment out of it, all the way to, these days we're just going to overdose somebody. They're going to go to sleep quietly. And that's where you're going to have to get to your sense of justice. And we've evolved. We've changed enormously in that regard. The last public hanging in the United States was in 1936, and 20,000 people showed up to watch it, and people made a bundle selling hot dogs and soft drinks while this was going on. And this is an unrecognizable world now. And then all we have to do is look at, say, societies that have different views of that. Scandinavia. I spent a bunch of time talking about the case of Anders Breivik. He was the white supremacist mass murderer in Norway who gunned down 70 plus teenagers at a socialist summer camp, and the worst crime in the history of Norway. And he was giving Nazi salutes all the way through his trial and expressed the only remorse he had was he didn't want to kill more kids. And he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the longest jail sentence that Norway ever has handed out. And he lives basically in an apartment with an exercise machine and internet access and art classes. And if he has good behavior, he can go on a ski trip just like all the other. Oh my God, what is wrong with those people? And they've got a fifth the recidivism rate that we do, and they have a completely different societal attitude. They've gotten to the point where justice has been done for Norwegians consist of, that's the longest jail sentence we have ever given to anyone. Society means it. They recognize the pain of our victims. And where you get family members of the victims who would be interviewed afterward and saying things like, well, what do you think of the outcome? And saying, well, justice has been served. We never have to think about him again. We never have to think about this narcissistic lump of mediocrity and lack of empathy. We never have to think of that was justice served in Norwegian societies. It's inconceivable to us. The American press bellowed at the offensiveness of how this trial was conducted. The prosecutor shook hands with the defendant. They referred to him by his first name. They're at a different stage of the evolution of this. We can't conceive of a world like that here in the United States. We can't conceive of a world in which you draw and quarter somebody in the town square and pour molten lead on the genitals that you've just chopped off to the cheering crowd. We've switched. It evolves. So all you have to do is push against that sense of pleasure in punishment and try to take it to the next level of understanding that punishment as a virtue in and of itself, just like reward as a virtue in and of itself, is very, very problematic. And you got to push against the visceral pulls that it has.
Thank you for describing that portion of the book. There's somebody here who said, as a reader of Behave, who found your arguments about free will persuasive, I'm curious to know how and why you decided to write and publish the new book, Determined, and also and especially whether your beliefs about anything related changed through the process or whether, well, it was already predetermined.
Well, what's changed is my self-assurance that I'm as clear of a communicator as I thought I was, in that the questioner seems to be one of the exceptions. After this book, Behave, came out, Behave, the biology of humans at our best and worst, and 700 pages going through what happened a second ago, a minute ago, 1,000 years ago, all of that. And I assumed anyone who like made it out the other end of it alive would be convinced there's no free will. And I would give lots of talks about this afterward. And people would ask things like, wow, if all this is true, maybe we have less free will than we often think we are. I'm saying, oh no, I thought I was going to convince everyone there's none whatsoever. I'm going to have to write a very unsubtle book now that's going to just like hit the person over the head every other paragraph or so for hundreds of pages. Okay, I've got to write a book now explicitly saying when you take all those pieces of biology, environment, blah, blah, and put them all together, we have absolutely no free will, which is the first half of the book. And the second half is, oh my God, what if people actually started thinking this way? How are we supposed to function? So I thought I had accomplished all of this about 6 years ago, and it turned out I hadn't. So maybe I will now with this new book.
So there's a group of questions around how do we know, how do we figure out whether certain things are probabilistic versus truly determined versus maybe chaotic or random? How do you parse that?
Great questions. I devoted 6 chapters very grudgingly to trying to deal with like sleight of hand, sneak free will in the back door attempts, taking advantage of some recent scientific revolutions. First one, chaoticism, chaos theory, totally cool, totally wonderful. And despite what a whole bunch of people insist, you can't pull free will out of chaoticism. 2 more chapters, emergent complexities, some of the coolest stuff in the world out there is totally great as how ants and our brains are identical and all sorts of it, but you can't pull free will out of that. And then, of course, inevitably, last 2 chapters on quantum indeterminacy, that's not going to be where you get free will from. Where does that stuff come in? It doesn't play a big role in how we assess the past, because we can sit there and with enough insights, we can see how that person became who they were at the time that they did that action. Post hoc, being able to see where the determinism was. Where that stuff, especially chaoticism, becomes very pertinent is why we can't predict the future. Why, at any given point, there are multiple possible futures because of the chaoticism of butterfly effects of things of that sort. That is absolutely what the future is about. But once we see how that unpredictable future has turned out, we will be able to see how the response to it was deterministic. The future right now is unpredictable, but once the future turns into was, we will see how there was determinism and no free will in what went on. And the big thing that happens is people get suckered into confusing unpredictable with undetermined. Probability, stochastics, chaoticism, emergence is all the reasons why the future is not predictable and never will be conformally proved, as that you could never fully predict a system down to its reductive building blocks because of chaoticism. But nonetheless, once it happens, it will have been entirely lacking free will in terms of what occurred. And this is really a crazy making split in the road there, but that is how it works.
And why do you think, you may have heard not everybody agrees with you. Why do you think, what are the psychological sources of resistance to determinism? And then I'll add my own little gloss on this question. What are the best arguments? What are the ones that you have the hardest time wrestling with?
Okay. Why are people resistant to it? And like I've got an incredible number of not only hostile book reviews, but really hostile emails, some really ones that stop you in your tracks. So that's been kind of interesting. Damn, I don't know what's going on out in most corners of this country out there. Big surprise. But okay, why are people resistant to it? Because it's alarming, it's depressing, it suggests you've got to forgive anyone for anything they've done. It suggests you have not earned the brownie points you've gotten in your life. What it is really tapping into is something about the evolution of humans and some very, like one god of evolutionary theory, Robert Trivers, has spent a lot of time thinking about the fact that if we were going to evolve into being a species that's smart enough to know everybody you love and you as well are going to die someday, the only way we could still function is if we evolved an enormous capacity for self-deception, for rationalizing, and we're incredibly good at that as a species. And all you have to do is look at diseases where people are not able to rationalize away reality, and that's major depression. In major depression, rationalization, false optimism, all of that goes down the tubes, and there's all sorts of domains in which depressed individuals are sadder but wiser because they're realistic about the world. And that is a life-threatening disease. We evolved an enormous capacity for self-deception, and what there being no free will is about is it challenges that. Why, nonetheless, do I think this is a good thing? For a very simple reason. So maybe if there's no free will, you did not deserve your Stanford admissions letter, let alone your Stanford degree. Maybe you don't deserve your corner office. Maybe you don't deserve the fact that somebody loves you and that you have the capacity for love. Maybe you don't deserve the praise that you get for being a kind person, any of that. Bummer, like this existential bummer. What a total drag, all of that. And my point with this is there's a problem with this book and with this subject, which is if you're sitting around and you're a Stanford alum, if you're sitting around and listening to a damn lecture about the nature of free will, if you're sitting around thinking about any of this stuff, by definition, you're one of the lucky ones. You're one of the privileged humans who's not instead out trying to find enough firewood for tonight, or who's not ignored by society or homeless or any version of that, that you're one of the lucky ones because what you are doing is dealing with the consequences of the fact that irrationally society treats some people way better than average for reasons they had nothing whatsoever to do with. If you're a much more average human, what you're dealing with is society treating some people way worse than average for reasons they had nothing whatsoever to do with. And thus, there's this horrible screen. Anyone who can sit there and be like some professorial naval contemplator or then listen to a lecture about it, by definition, you're in the lucky bunch for whom a lack of free will is mostly a bummer. For most people, it's going to be enormously liberating. And all, again, we have to do is look at the history. Kids who have learning differences, we don't tell them anymore they're lazy. And the whole world is full of 40-year-olds who say, God, if I had gotten that dyslexia diagnosis when I was 10 instead of 40, I wouldn't have just spent my whole life hating myself. If I had gotten that autism diagnosis, I wouldn't have spent my whole life thinking I'm weird and cold and an unlovable person. I wouldn't have. And all of those, if this is a bummer, we're the lucky ones. And that takes a lot of work to remember.
Well, on that note, I want to say that we were indeed the lucky ones to get to listen to you for the past hour. Thank you for spending it with us. And thank you so much to Jeffrey Rainey and the Stanford Club of Minnesota.
Thank you all.